just to put it very bluntly, you've been accused of being an anti-Semite. So you definitely knew that this was going to push the boundaries and you were trying to stir up the pot. It's not just a book that you've written as an arm's length biographer, but you yourself are also one of the main characters in the book. Tell us exactly what are the sequence of events that led up to this.
So I think the story, I would say, begins in terms of my own relationship to this issue, begins when I was living in Bethlehem.
So, hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Book Cafe podcast. First and foremost, Eid Mubarak and happy Bengali New Year to all who are observing and celebrating. I'm your host, Omar Nizam, and in today's episode, we will be speaking to Professor Dr. Rebecca Ruth Gould about her 2023 book, Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. So, Professor, it's really great to connect with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay. So, Professor, I have to say that you've written an extraordinary book, and I've really enjoyed reading it. And it's a book about the Palestinian cause, but it's not just a book that you've written as an arm's length biographer or historian, but you yourself are also one of the main characters in the book. Just to put it very bluntly, you've been accused of being an anti-Semite. And there's a lot of sequence of events that led up to this accusation. So maybe we can start from there and you can tell us exactly what are the sequence of events that led up to this accusation of being an anti-Semite. Do please walk us through that.
Certainly. So first, thanks for reading the book and for inviting me. So I think the story, I would say, begins in terms of my own relationship to this issue, begins when I was living in Bethlehem in the West Bank in from 2011 to 2012. I had a postdoctoral fellowship at an institute called the Van Leer Institute. It's still there in Jerusalem. And I sort of rather unusually, I think, for people who have this fellowship, I insisted on living in Palestine, so not Jerusalem. I wanted my reason for accepting it was to learn more about Palestine and Palestinian studies. And so what that meant was I, to some extent, of course, never completely, but to some extent, I experienced what it's like, what Palestinian workers experience, to a much greater degree, the ones who cross over into Jerusalem. So the lucky ones. I mean, the checkpoints, the kind of dehumanization that takes place. I certainly saw that, the frustration of having to wait in lines for 5 hours and not knowing if you're going to be able to get to the other side. And it definitely opened my eyes. It really made an issue that I think up to that point had been very kind of abstract into something very, very concrete that I couldn't look away from. And so I sort of lived that life for about a year. And then it was actually a 5-year fellowship. But by the first year, by the time that was ending, I think I was just pretty overwhelmed by the sense of kind of hypocrisy that I, as a U.S. citizen, as someone who was working in Jerusalem, I mean, I was very frustrated with what I was seeing and frustrated with myself. And so I wrote this article called Beyond Anti-Semitism that was about how the Holocaust is instrumentalized in Israel today to distract people from looking at what's happening with the occupation. And I think it's worth saying that when I wrote that, I was really channeling a lot of what I was hearing in the sort of left-wing Israeli media. So it didn't seem like something, I mean, I think, inevitably these topics are always going to be controversial, but it wasn't like beyond the pale of what was already being said by critics of Israel. And so I published that, and then I left. I resigned from my position, moved on to other things in life. And what I wrote in 2011 came back to haunt me 5 years later when I was in the UK at the University of Bristol. And at that point, I think it was kind of an accident that I found myself in the crossroads of a very sort of significant historical moment in the UK because just a few in it was 2016, December 2016, under Theresa May's government, she was the former prime minister, conservative prime minister.
Right.
She was the first prime minister to first made the UK the first government to adopt what's called the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And so that's a definition, I'm sure talk about that in a lot more detail, that conflates anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. So I think, I mean, there's a lot to be said about that the significance of that historically, but just in terms of my own autobiography, at that same time when this was happening, one of my students, who I actually, normally sometimes when you say a student, it means someone like I knew very well. Actually, this is someone I'd never actually spoken to, but he was in one of my classrooms, and he learned of my sort of background in Palestine, what I'd written about Palestine. And he had decided that he was identifies himself as a Zionist defender of Israel, and he didn't like what I'd written, and in his view it was anti-Semitic. But I think what's really important is that he linked that analysis of his to this IHRA definition, and at a time that was kind of new in the UK context, that wasn't really happening as much, and so it was really one of the first times that have been done in a university context. And and so then the media picked up, he published an op-ed in the student newspaper, gradually was picked up by the right-wing media, and there was a sort of campaign to get me fired. And again, I tried to make, I mean, so that I couldn't avoid these questions, of what is anti-Semitism and so forth. But I did try to, in writing the book, obviously I did want to tell that story because I think it was very traumatic, and there was a kind of therapeutic aspect of telling that story. But it wasn't just about me. Obviously we see all around us this is happening, and it's picking up speed. And I think it's worth saying that my story came kind of at the beginning of this process of the conflation, particularly in the UK. So that's sort of the point of departure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for recapping that for us. And yes, you're right. There's a lot that needs to be unpacked here. So let's start with a couple of definitions. I think that would be a good starting point. So in your mind, Professor, I mean, how should one define the term anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism vis-a-vis the IHRA's problematic definition of anti-Semitism? So maybe you could just help us with these three terms. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and I think it's also worth adding going back a bit deeper in history. I mean, it does have to be said, we have this word anti-Semitism. That word itself has a problematic history in the sense that the person who introduced the term anti-Semite was anti-Semitic. His name is Wilhelm Marr. He was a German in the 19th century, and he actually formed a club of anti-Semites, and that was what they called themselves because they were very proud to hate Jews. They were German nationalists, and so that's where we get the term from, which I think says something about how kind of confused our categories for dealing with this issue of Jew hatred. So yeah, I'll try to take each of these points in turn. I guess, I mean, the most important one there, you said anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and IHRA definitions. So I'll start with anti-Semitism, which I definitely, do believe is a problem. It's a real issue. And we don't have the vocabulary really for thinking about it. So the first thing I just would say about that, maybe it's something we'll return to later, is I think it is more useful to think of it as a kind of racism, right? Of locating the hatred of Jews historically is at a basic level, it's not that different from the hatred of Muslims or of Blacks. Obviously there are differences, of course, there are historical differences, but I think that's the kind of framework that's more useful. And it's worth saying that because there are a lot of forces right now at this moment that try to separate those things out and say that there's no relationship, so and actually maybe I'll turn now to the IHRA definition, because that's exactly, I mean, there are many critiques of it, but that's one of the biggest critiques, is that it treats anti-Semitism as something that has nothing to do with racism. That's more like an attitude towards Israel rather than actually, hatred of Jews, or the stereotyping of their physical characteristics. Just that's not really discussed in this definition. And also it might be maybe useful to give a little bit of historical context of what this is. So it stands for the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. This is a document, basically, it's been around for a few decades, and it became kind of formalized about just over a decade ago. and this sort of international congress, and then gradually all the major Western powers had a representative there, and the idea was just to kind of come up with a consensus definition of what anti-Semitism is, and specifically to make it to include sort of what's called the new anti-Semitism, which means anti-Semitism that is critical of Israel within that.
Right.
And after that was sort of agreed on as a consensus definition, that in other words, criticism, one of the main types of anti-Semitism, according to this definition, is criticism of Israel. Then the organization its representatives began to lobby for it to be adopted by various institutions, various governments. And yeah, so that's what there are 11 examples in this definition. You can find it, anyone can find it online through Google and so forth. Probably people have heard of it a lot by now. But there are 11 examples. 7 of those examples talk about criticism of Israel, and some of them are very kind of abstract, like holding Israel to a double standard, for example. That's seen as anti-Semitic. I think, and that takes us very far from racism at a material level, and I think that's kind of part of the problem. It turns the debate around anti-Semitism into a kind of geopolitical debate about politics, not what we know racism to be. So, so that's some of the key problems with it. And then anti-Zionism is, well, it is a couple of things. I mean, I think the first thing it's a very deeply held Jewish tradition of kind of thinking about the diasporic Jewish existence as something that's meaningful in itself, and something that as much as Jews have faced tremendous discrimination throughout millennia, many of the most important Jewish intellectuals are very much tied to the idea of living as diasporic lives, outside of Israel. They don't idealize the homeland. And so that's a tradition that even predates Zionism itself. Another way of thinking about anti-Zionism is a kind of leftist movement that questions the legitimacy of the state of Israel. And sometimes it just does that, it questions it, just as that movement would criticize the legitimacy of any nation state, that engages in occupation and apartheid. So it's not necessarily specifically targeting Israel. And as you can see from my definitions and descriptions, there's nothing inherently anti-Semitic about those points of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I did have an opportunity to go through your article, Professor, and I have to say that I could not understand what the fuss was all about, because I thought it was extremely well written. You made a lot of valid points, and you've described it as a polemic rather than as a work of scholarship, right? So you definitely knew that this was going to push the boundaries, and you were trying to stir up the pot, but at the same time, you're also calling attention to something that really needed the world to, fixate or at least focus on a wrong that was going on right in front of your eyes during your residency in Bethlehem. So let us detour a little bit and talk about the article itself, Professor. So it's entitled Beyond Anti-Semitism. So did you pick this title for the article deliberately in order to, stir up the pot? So maybe we can start from there. So tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I did. It was just a sense of frustration that, that was the term. Just like, for example, right now, when we look at the genocide in Gaza, and people want to talk about Hamas and condemning Hamas, I felt like that type of phenomenon was happening in my world, where instead of talking about occupation, there was always an attempt to change the subject to anti-Semitism, and it wasn't, even when it wasn't really relevant or helpful. And so, it was just like, let's stop. Let's just put a pause on this subject for a while and look at what's happening in Palestine. And it's, it is worth saying that that's where I was living. It wasn't like kind of an armchair activist or academic writing about something happening thousands of miles away. I was really writing about what was there, what was in front of my eyes. In fact, I remember very concretely when I wrote that I just returned from a trip to Hebron, and I visited, which is a city where the occupation is arguably one of the most advanced. The surveillance is extremely invasive in Palestinians' lives, like it goes into their homes and their windows. And I'd also just visited the tomb of this Baruch Goldstein. He is a Israeli who perpetrated a massacre a few decades ago in Hebron. And at his tomb, in fact, it was at a Jewish settlement. He was treated as a hero. And so I felt when all of these things are happening, let's just turn the subject a little bit to Palestinians. yeah,
Yeah,
so that was
yeah.
kind of what was driving the title.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've name dropped Professor Dr. Ilan Pappé a couple of times in the article,
Hmm.
and we've been
Hmm.
very privileged to have had him on the show as well. In fact, this is his book on Palestine, which he
Oh,
co
right. Mhm.
Frank Barrett. I would have your book up here as well, but unfortunately, I don't have a physical copy of the book, but I do have
Oh, okay.
the downloaded
Uh-huh.
version. So we usually have the book. But anyways, coming back to Professor Dr. Ilan Pappé, there was even though he's very good friends with Gideon Levy, the Israeli journalist who's also a columnist at
Hmm.
Haaretz. Professor Pappé was a bit averse towards the Haaretz, newspaper, the left-wing newspaper that has a very anti-occupation stance, but at the same time, I couldn't figure out what was the reason why Professor Pappé wasn't as warm towards Haaretz, but you
Hmm.
actually gave the answer in your Beyond Anti-Semitism article. So would you mind walking us through that, Professor? So what happened between Haaretz and Professor Pappé that led to the animosity between the two? So yeah, tell us about that.
Oh, wow. I think I'm it's been so long. In fact, I think I'm going to be challenged to give the details. I remember following the steps of how he was expelled from was it Haifa University? But I'm
Yeah.
not sure I remember the Haifa. So maybe you can answer that your own question.
Yes. He was with Haifa University up till 2006,
Hmm.
2007, and then around that time, I believe that as per what you've written in the article, that Professor Pape talked about the occupation, but then at the same time he was criticized for something he didn't say, which is that you have to juxtapose it with the Jewish suffering,
Hmm.
and so because
Hmm.
he left it out of that out of his writings, he got into a conflict with Israeli academia, and as a result, he decided to leave Israel on his own accord, and he took up a position with the University of Exeter in the UK. So yeah,
Hmm.
but yeah, long story short, I was really pleased to actually find that bit of information because I treasure anything that teaches me something new, and we didn't get this out of Professor Pape himself as to why
Mm,
what exactly
interesting.
happened, but thank you for that though. So let's talk about the second book that I have up here, and this is Orientalism by Edward Said. And you've name dropped
Mm.
Edward Said many times in the book as well as in the article. How big of an influence has Edward Said and his writings been on your worldview? So do tell us about that.
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Yeah, he's definitely one of my heroes.
Mhm.
And I'm so honored that I went to Columbia, obviously after Said, but that
Mhm.
was his presence was so palpable. Yeah, I mean, I think actually maybe the thing that I mean, there's a lot to be said about Edward Said, but the first thing I would say is actually maybe not what you would expect. That sort of draws me to him. It's just number one, what an amazing writer. I mean, he just
Mhm.
really knows how to put sentences together, and that's so important, I think, for getting the message out, clarifying the stakes. I just love the way he writes, and I love the way that he balances sort of attention to politics with attention to literature. That is
Mhm.
absolutely I mean, it's my goal. That's what I emulate. So that's something, and people don't always talk about that aspect of him, but how often is it that a literature professor becomes like an expert on Palestinian politics? Doesn't happen
Politics,
all the
yeah.
time. And he had that ability. And I'll even go further. I think that his literary background really gave his politics a kind of purchase, a kind of viscerality, a kind of
Mhm.
persuasiveness, that sometimes more abstract speculations don't really achieve. So yeah, it's sort of his method as a writer, as a thinker means a lot to me. He could move between both worlds, between sort of English literature and Palestinian culture, Palestinian literature with incredible skill and nuance. Um, yeah, so all of his works mean a lot to me. I would say Orientalism, I mean, it always happens, that one book is associated
Mhm.
with a great name, and
Right.
then there are other
Yeah.
books get forgotten. So I don't necessarily know if, Orientalism was one of his early works.
Mhm.
I don't know. I kind of feel like some of his later work is even more searching and even more just thoughtful, and but as a kind of as a book of its time, a book that really changed the discourse, and that made people think. It's been incredibly powerful and incredibly useful, making it really not so easy, to just
Mhm.
assume that the Western perspective is always the main one. That's kind of the achievement of Orientalism. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something I carried with me throughout my time, and I carry with me now.
Yeah, for sure. And so at the end of this episode, so I will ask you a couple of staple questions with regards to
Mhm.
some of your favorite books written by Edward Said, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so we'll
Okay.
save that for later. But circling back to your Beyond Anti-Semitism article, Professor, so I just want to quote something that you've written. You concluded the article by saying that perhaps it is time to stop privileging the Holocaust as the central event in Jewish history. But if I were to push back a little bit here, Professor, and say that, there'll be some critics who say that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. What would be your response to those people who say that, we shouldn't remove the Holocaust as a focal point of Jewish history?
Right. So here's what I would say. And first of all, I'm definitely not like arguing for a kind of diminishment of the Holocaust, or it's just but my answer to that, I think, is if anything, it increases its importance. It's that we should also think about the history through which the Holocaust became central, because in fact it's not the case that right after the extermination of the Jews in Auschwitz, then immediately everyone started studying the Holocaust. Not at all.
Yeah.
The Holocaust as a sort of subject of scholarship, it really only became a field, so to speak, in say the 60s and 70s. And my source for that is Michael Rothberg. He's a professor at UCLA. He talks about that. There was a lot of suppression, a lot of silence, a lot of shame around the Holocaust, which all of us, I think, is really problematic, and so it was necessary to kind of push for the Holocaust as a kind of something that should be talked about and should be studied, shouldn't be erased and suppressed. That was a really important thing to do, in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And so maybe that's, but I would say at this moment in time, in the 2020s, we have more to gain by putting the Holocaust in a kind of a comparative context, right? So comparing it to other genocides, not treating it as like, the only horrific act that humanity has perpetrated on other humans. Because we have a lot of examples of that. We could learn more from that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say, that we need, alongside understanding the Holocaust on its own terms and what happened and why, we need a history of the study of the Holocaust, and we need to think about it in a way that doesn't set it apart from history. We need to place it in history.
Right. So in other words, it needs to be studied in context. So if it's taken out of context,
Absolutely.
it's simply being weaponized for ulterior motives. And just staying with the Jewish Holocaust, Professor, I also want to make reference to, for lack of a better term, the American Holocaust of the indigenous Americans, maybe the settler Holocaust of the indigenous Americans. So it is quite surprising for non-Americans to realize that this is completely absent from US school curriculum. Why do you think that is? And do you believe that this inability of Americans to actually come to terms with their own history is one of the reasons why prior to October 6th, for example, a lot of people may have turned a blind eye to what Israel was doing? Your thoughts on that, please.
That certainly fits with my own education. It's not something that I learned about in school. We celebrate Thanksgiving as school children. I mean, maybe things have changed a little bit, but
right.
we'll talk about its settler colonial origins and its genocidal aspects. It's real. We see is that it's really difficult for powerful countries in particular to acknowledge their guilt and complicity. And so, I think maybe Americans, perhaps more than any other country in the world, do have a kind of amnesia. Even like I was going to say Germany, but I mean, I think even America is like off the charts in terms of kind of ignorance. I have to say, I mean, that's just a fact, right? There's just a lack of global awareness, and that's partly just to do with like the size of the country and this idea that it's self-sufficient under the world. But I think there's there's in that sense there's a identification with Israel, because Israel is also a country that has not reckoned with its settler colonial past. It's, in fact, the Nakba is actually banned as a topic of discussion. And then the other country that's in a kind of alliance with Israel at the moment is Germany, which it seems, has also not really dealt with its own genocidal past. And we see that through its alliance with Israel. So that those three countries, I think, do exemplify what you're saying.
Absolutely. And speaking of Germany, Professor, I think it's just I mean, the world is astonished, I would say, at its blanket, carte blanche support for Israel, as though, supporting Israel no matter what is going to help atone for the Nazi
Right.
atrocities, and it's just absurd,
Mhm.
So let's stick to Germany a little bit, Professor. In your opinion, what do you think would be the best way to, kind of educate? And speaking just as an educator, what changes would you recommend to German school curriculum to help them sympathize or empathize more with what the Palestinians are going through, vis-a-vis just
Mhm.
giving a carte blanche to Israel no matter what, to help atone for the dark past? So your thoughts on that, please. Tell us
Right.
about that.
So I certainly would. I mean, before I get to the question of how they can empathize with Palestinians, I also think it's worth noting that one
Mhm.
third of the people who have been arrested in the recent crackdown on pro-Palestine activism have been Jews. So that
Mhm.
suggests, I think, that Germany still has a very big problem,
Mhm.
with
Right.
Jews. They haven't. I mean, they're
Mhm.
happy with Jews in Israel, but they are targeting Jews. There's no other way of saying that. They really
Mhm.
are. They're targeting Jews who don't fit a certain ideological framework, which is one that is not diasporic, one that does not really see a future for Jews in Germany,
Mhm.
unless they support Israel. So I mean, so it's just as a kind of starting point with that, I would say that they should learn about Jewish history, before Israel, before Zionism in Germany.
Mhm.
It wasn't always by any means a history of rampant anti-Semitism. In fact, it could be said that one reason why Jews in Germany specifically were targeted during the Holocaust was because they had been pretty successful at
Mhm.
assimilating themselves. They were among the wealthiest, the most successful, and the most integrated. And people, and then so that made people very angry. But I think that should be remembered, that actually there's Jews before the Holocaust in Germany are a kind of success story of assimilation. Like Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin. I mean, these are all people that were completely assimilated within German culture.
Right.
And I also want to give a shout out. You should maybe have him on your program. Amos Goldberg. He's a
Mhm.
professor at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, a historian of the
Mhm.
Holocaust,
Yeah.
whose work I really admire, and he was very supportive of me when I was accused of anti-Semitism. And he makes a really
Mhm.
interesting point in his analysis of the Holocaust, which is that we often assume, that it was all about anti-Semitism, that without that was it, that was the driving force, there was nothing else. Well, but I think if you really want to understand the Holocaust, you also have to think about fascism, right?
Mhm.
It's
Right.
not
Yeah.
just that the Germans were anti-Semitic, it's that they had the kind of the power, the government had the power to orchestrate this genocide. And so it was those two things to combine together. So that's, I think there should be education at multiple fronts in the German
Mhm.
school system and the political class, and that could begin actually just with not stereotyping Jews, as people who belong in another country.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah.
actually part of German history,
Mhm.
and they don't need
Mhm.
to be targeted if they're anti-Zionist. And then, of course, I mean, yes, Palestine. It's interesting because I believe the Palestinian community in Germany, in Berlin, is the
Yeah.
largest
In Europe?
Palestinian diaspora in
Okay.
Europe. Yeah.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
certainly there's a community, there's a place to begin.
Right.
I don't think it's all, and maybe that's why everyone's so shocked, because there are wonderful things there.
Mhm.
Before this crackdown, there was, I mean, I've been to the Palestinian neighborhoods in Germany, and they're very vibrant, very, full of Palestinian culture and
Mhm.
life. And so I would say, just more of that. I
Mhm.
do have hope. I think,
Right.
it is
Yeah.
it's never a straightforward process, but
Mhm.
I think there's a basis for something to become better.
Okay. Professor, let me ask you a tangential question. So we've seen, the Israeli atrocities being perpetrated against Palestinians. We've seen America supporting this by, supplying weapons, etc. But how complicit have the Arab governments themselves been? Not the Arab people, but the Arab governments like Egypt, Jordan,
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia, the
Mhm.
UAE, etc., who have simply turned a blind eye to all of this
Mhm.
because they're so scared of what Iran might be doing, because Iran's an expansionist
Right.
power, and perhaps because they're a Shia majority country. And so they've all placed their eggs in one basket with Israel and the US. And they've simply, shut down the conversation vis-a-vis the Palestinians. So do you believe that the Arab governments should also be held accountable to what we're seeing right now in Gaza? Your thoughts on that, please. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also think that that question enables me to bring in another theme that is central to my book, which is free speech.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because free speech and democracy go together. And I
Right.
think when part of what I was arguing with my book, with Erasing Palestine, and based on, you know, my experience of being suppressed, is that the struggle for Palestinian liberation requires that. It's not optional. It needs a
Mm-hmm.
democratic process. It's free speech at the center of it. And
Yep.
what in these Arab countries that you're talking about, what is very
Mm-hmm.
striking is that there is a gap, you know, between what the people, the views of the people, and the views of their
Mm-hmm.
monarchies. So I think that shows how a democratic deficit and a lack of free speech is directly harmful, you know, to the Palestinian cause. It's not like a secondary issue. It's something that, because if the will of the Egyptian people, the people of Yemen, I mean, we've seen the size of those protests, was reflected in the decisions of their government, then it would be a completely different scenario for Palestinians. I think, you know, up until 1967, I mean, there were a lot of compromises made by Jordan, and then Egypt, you know, tried to step in to support Palestine and completely
Mm-hmm.
failed. And after that, it's been a downhill trajectory. So yeah, there's a lot of lack of accountability to go around, and I think at the heart of that is precisely a lack of democracy. That would force the Arab countries to do more to support Palestinians.
For sure, for sure. And then, of course, I think that this is probably the disconnect that a lot of lay historians or perhaps the general public needs to be more aware of, that even if you do see, protests for Palestine, in support of Palestine, it is usually it's mostly the people, but the governments are playing a completely different ball game, or they're on a completely different wavelength altogether, and they're
Right.
completely aligned with Israel as part of their geopolitical policy. But coming
Absolutely.
back to, yeah, absolutely. But coming back to the book, Professor, I just want to touch upon one thing that you've written there right at the end. So you said that you concluded the book by saying that you returned to this whole episode forced you, or actually enabled you or motivated you to actually reflect on your own past as a woman of Jewish heritage. So, and I think that that's extremely ironic, given the fact that a Jewish woman being accused of being anti-Semitic. How does that even work? If I were to just make a comparison, you're either a Nazi or a non-Nazi, but how can you be both at the same time? These are mutually exclusive, right? So I've never understood that. I mean, if you're Muslim or anti-Muslim, but these are mutually exclusive, and
Right.
I can't find any universe where these two would interact sort of like a Venn diagram. But I'll leave it to you to have the final word on this, Professor. So how did this help you in your personal journey into
Mhm.
investigating more into your own background? So do tell us about that.
Yeah, so it was definitely not an outcome I would have expected either. But I'd
Mhm.
always known, I'd grown up with the knowledge that on my father's side of the family, they were of Jewish heritage, and then they'd suppress that heritage. So I wasn't raised Jewish, but I knew that that was my history. And I
Right.
never really I never had a reason to kind of ask myself, why did they do that? Why did they suppress their heritage? Why don't I know more about my Jewish roots? And yeah, so then suddenly, and so you know, the question of anti-Semitism was as remote for me as the question of Jewish identity. It just wasn't part of my sort of list of topics that were preoccupying me. But being accused of anti-Semitism does make you think about that, right? Because
Mhm.
I knew I wasn't, but I kind of felt the need to kind of take those accusations seriously. You know, I'm generally, I mean, when I'm as a white person, I think if someone sort of flakes something for
Mhm.
me, I shouldn't just close my eyes. I do believe there's value in listening to people's perspectives. So you know, I tried to sort of think through the accusations. I didn't agree with them. You know, I knew that I just was describing what I was seeing, but I did want to understand, like, how could they have arrived at that? And so yeah, so then I began to asking my family members why, like, for example, my original name was
Right.
Goldstein. That was, or
Mhm.
Goldstone. Goldstein was changed to Goldstone, and then yeah,
Mhm.
so there was
Mhm.
gradual suppression of Jewish identity. And one of my father's father was actually a virulent anti-Semite. Again, it seemed like kind of a
Mm.
overcompensation for his past.
Right.
And yeah, so it was. But then I researched that some of my ancestors were very well-known rabbis in Poland before they had to emigrate due to anti-Semitism in the 19th century. And yeah, it definitely was a kind of wake-up call, and brought me close to this issue, and it gave me the chance to discover other amazing Jewish writers, like worth mentioning,
Yeah.
Abram Leon, a very brilliant anti-Zionist Trotsky
Right.
Jewish intellectual who was killed in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
It gave me a sense of kind of solidarity with them, and
Hmm.
to understand that
Yeah.
the critique of Israel, the opposition, the critique of the oppression of Palestinians is also partly a Jewish project. I mean, it's first and foremost a Palestinian project, and I think we should always center
Mm.
their perspective and experience. But given the way the path history has taken us, it's part of kind of the obligation of having Jewish connections as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Abraham Leon, Professor, and I have to confess that I wasn't familiar with who he was before I read the book. And I think we'd be doing an injustice to this episode if we didn't talk a
Right.
little bit about him. So would you mind telling us who was he and what was his ideology and viewpoints? And I suppose you're quite aligned with a lot of what he says, right? But I'll let you take us through that. Tell us who he was and what was
Absolutely.
his thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was a wonderful discovery for me too. I think I probably knew
Mm.
his name, but I really had to research the history of anti-Zionism, for the book before I became fully aware of his importance and contribution.
Yeah.
And so he was a Jew who was born in Poland in the 19 the 1920s,
Hmm.
roughly.
Yeah.
Part of a sort of cohort, you could say, of Jewish intellectuals like Rosa Luxemburg, leftist Jewish radicals who were born into that world of relative poverty, but intense intellectual commitment.
Hmm.
Um, and he initially also, like many of his world, looked to Zionism as a kind of solution to his own issues, his own social challenges, economic disenfranchisement. But he very quickly, his family, when he was a child, he lived in Israel briefly before it became Israel. Sorry, lived in Palestine,
Right.
in the 1920s. Before,
Hmm.
yeah, but then he very quickly didn't realize that there was a problem with the Zionist
Hmm.
project. And I think he had a very kind of early critique of Zionism. And he went on to align himself with Trotskyism, which is the communism that diverged from Stalin. So he understood, that's what I like about him. He was critical of all kinds of authoritarian
Hmm.
philosophies, right? So
Right. Yeah.
he supported the freedom of the working class, and first and foremost, in the liberation of Jews and of other oppressed peoples, including colonized peoples, that he writes about actually in his book. So his most famous achievement, which unfortunately he didn't live to see
Hmm.
himself, is a
Right.
book called "The Jewish Question:
Right.
A Materialist Approach."
Hmm.
It was written in French. The original French is "A
Hmm.
Materialist Approach to the Jewish Question."
Okay.
And
Awesome.
it is, I would say, it kind of picks up on Marx in a certain sense. Marx wrote a controversial essay called "The Jewish Question,"
Hmm.
that I think makes some interesting points, but it doesn't go deep at all into the history of
Hmm.
anti-Semitism. It
Right. Yeah.
doesn't go far enough in terms of its attempt to understand anti-Semitism. So Abraham Liam goes much deeper. He sort of looks at the whole history of
Hmm.
anti-Semitism from thousands of
Hmm.
years ago.
Wow.
And he sees
Yeah.
it in terms of class conflict. He applies a Marxist lens. And it was a very brave book to write. He wrote it under Nazi occupation
Hmm.
in Belgium. So he was
Yeah.
also editor, he was a journalist. He was editor of an illegal newspaper that was circulated in just these sort of one-page formats. And while he was working on that book, he went to visit his home in a town called Charleroi, and he was taken by the Gestapo. And eventually he was executed in Auschwitz, but he did manage to smuggle out the notes of this book that were published a few years later.
Right.
in French. And so it's a masterpiece. It should be read by everyone.
Wow.
I really wonder why, more people don't know. It's also been translated into Arabic. It was translated in the 1960s by a freedom fighter. And I think it's a very important book for Palestinians to read too, Arabs in general, everyone. I mean, just to see that,
Right. Yeah.
to challenge the kind of narratives produced by Israel. So it's if anything, it's the most important book
Wow.
that comes after my book.
Well, I have to say that you've really motivated me to learn more about
Great.
Abraham Leon and to pick up the book. So perhaps we could,
Wonderful.
since he's no longer with us, perhaps we could have another episode where we have a book
Absolutely.
discussion on Abraham Leon
amazing.
and what
Yeah.
he's written. So thank you so much for that, Professor. I really appreciate your thoughts on that. Okay, so so at this point in time, Professor, I have to say that I've pretty much exhausted all of my questions as far as the book goes. But I do have a couple of staple questions for you that we love to ask all of our guests. As you know, that the show is called Book Cafe Podcast, so the word book is in the title. So it's a no-brainer that we have a couple of staple questions specifically related to books. And so I'll just
Mhm.
ask you two of them. So the first staple question that we have is, are you more of a fiction person or a non-fiction person? What genre of books do you enjoy reading?
So, I mean, I need both, but if I had to choose, it would be fiction. I mean,
Fiction?
fiction is what
Okay.
brought me kind of to life. It brought me to literature.
Yeah.
It made everything matter to me. When I was 16, I broke my femur bone, my biggest bone in the leg,
Okay.
and so
Okay.
I was bedridden. And I got to read all of the Russian classics, everything, and that was the most memorable
Oh,
moment for me. So, fiction.
okay, okay, fiction, and I should also take this opportunity to tell all our viewers and listeners that you're also a poet because you've written there is a poem that you've included
Right.
in the book, and would you mind reading that out to us because I really enjoyed it. So perhaps we could take the
Aha.
opportunity to talk about that. Yeah,
Absolutely. Just give me a second to find the page
sure.
here. I think there's a page on number page the second page of the book.
Right,
It's
right.
just an
Second.
excerpt from the poem. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's right. Workers greet the dawn behind the bars of checkpoint 300, waiting to build settlers' homes with stolen limestone.
Wow.
So it was a beautiful scene, but also a
Hmm.
very like a scene of discrimination. So that
Hmm.
was the image I was trying to evoke.
Right. Yeah. And I
Yeah, I
should
feel something you can only see
yeah.
in poetry. That's my feeling.
Okay, that's awesome. So I should probably ask you, tell us about Checkpoint 300 and why was it so
Mhm.
infamous? Tell us about that. Yeah.
So it's one of the largest checkpoints in the West Bay.
Mhm.
It's this sort of factory. It's very strange because it's a huge kind of construction, but it's often empty.
Mhm.
It's often closed because the Israelis don't want to let Palestinians through. And it's been the scene of riots.
Mhm.
When it is open, it does tend to get very, very crowded because
Mhm.
there are very large numbers of Palestinian workers who have to get across to Israel to make ends meet. And those are the lucky ones, as I said, who do have jobs in Jerusalem. And it's been the scene of riots. It's been the scene of, in fact, people have been crushed to death while waiting.
Mhm.
So you have these guards standing armed, sometimes undressing people who have to go through metal detectors, just a kind of scene of humiliation. I mean, I think all checkpoints
Mhm.
are like that, but just in terms
Yeah.
of the size of it,
Mhm.
it kind of stands out.
Right, right. Yeah, absolutely. And the stolen limestone, I have to ask you about that. So what was the
Right.
significance of the stolen limestone? Yeah.
Well, so any visitor to Jerusalem or to pretty much anywhere in Palestine will see that that's the defining feature of the landscape. It's this really beautiful sort of alabaster. I would
Mhm.
describe it alabaster color, very white limestone. All buildings are constructed from it, but now also, unfortunately, settlements are constructed from it. So that's stolen. It comes from
Right.
that, right?
Yeah.
It's indigenous to Palestine, and it has its own beauty, but you can also see it sort
Mhm.
of gradually defacing the landscape, and that's the worst part to see, that kind of transformation of something beautiful into some kind of monstrosity of oppression.
Well, I have to say it was quite poetic, Professor. So thank you so much for including that. And it really was interesting, to get your take on that. Okay, so the second staple question that we love to ask all of our guests, and I'm told that it's a tough question, but I'm sure that given that you're such an
Uh-huh.
avid reader, you'll be able to give us a really good answer to it. And the question if you could select a book that you feel that every young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it may or may not be a book on fiction. It could be a nonfiction book. It could be about history or geopolitics. It could be about anything at all. But if you could pick just one book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their lifetime, what would be your pick?
So it definitely would be fiction because I think, yeah, if you have to choose, that's the place where you empathize with other human beings is through fiction,
Mhm.
not through nonfiction. So again, I don't really think there's just one book. I mean, I
Right.
advocate many.
Yeah.
But if I could advocate a collection of short stories,
Mhm.
um, Hassan Kanafani, Palestinian writer,
Mhm.
particularly his stories Returning to Haifa and Men in the Sun.
Mhm.
Those are two stories that have just had a huge impact on me. And the kind of stories you could just read again and again and always see something new. Men in the Sun is about a group of Palestinian workers who have to go to Kuwait. I
Mhm.
won't sort of spoil anything, but
Yeah.
the way it chronicles their journey is just incredibly
Mhm.
perceptive. And what's so remarkable about Hassan Kanafani is that he was a multifaceted writer. He did write a lot of nonfiction. He was an activist, revolutionary, but when you read these fictions, he doesn't hammer you over the head with any kind of
Mhm.
ideology or anything. It's just he
Yeah.
just makes you into the world of these
Mhm.
Palestinians. And then Returning to Haifa, also a very well-known story about
Mhm.
a Palestinian couple
Yeah.
who returns to what used to be their home, now occupied
Okay.
by Israelis. And
I
in
see.
both cases, yeah, it takes you to another world.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. So I presume that he drives your curiosity and hence why it's so engaging. So yeah, thank you so much for that, Professor. We'll be sure to have the names of those books in the
Great.
description. Okay, so on that note, so let me just conclude by saying that for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. If you are watching this episode on YouTube, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let's try and get Professor Rebecca Gould's book out to as many people as possible. And of course, the book, once again, is Erasing Palestine, Free Speech and Palestinian Freedom. Professor, thank you for holding up the book. Yes. Professor, thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed talking to you. You've been a wonderful guest, and there's so much more that we could talk about, but I also want to be respectful of your time. I really appreciate it. It's really early in the morning in the UK. Thank you for doing this, and I really hope that we'll be able to talk again once your other book projects come out. By the way, do you have anything in the pipeline that your fans and readers can look forward to in the upcoming years? Yeah.
Um, I do, and that I actually haven't spoken about really to anyone, but it's kind of a potential book.
Mhm.
It's actually it will probably, I mean, if it materializes, it would be with someone in Gaza right now, about what they're seeing. I don't want to say more because I don't have, permission to talk about it, but potentially, yes, there's something in the works.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Professor, once again. And I will let you go now. So thank you so much for your time, and let's catch
Great.
up soon.
Goodbye.